I was buying vegetables at the corner market when I heard the shouting, the kind of raised voices that make everyone in a neighborhood stop what they're doing and pay attention. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late summer, the air thick with humidity and the smell of overripe fruit from the produce stand outside. The market sat on the corner of Delancey and Rivington, a cramped space that had served this neighborhood for 40 years, its aisles narrow and shelves stocked with the basics that working families needed to get through the week. I'd been comparing prices on canned tomatoes, the mundane arithmetic of poverty that occupied so much mental space for those of us living paycheck to paycheck, when the commotion outside pulled my attention to the large front window. Through the glass, I could see a small crowd gathering on the sidewalk, the kind of audience that forms when something ugly is happening in public, and people can't quite decide whether to intervene or simply bear witness. I abandoned my shopping basket and moved toward the door, drawn by that same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down at accident scenes, knowing I was about to see something I'd probably regret seeing, but unable to resist the pull of other people's drama unfolding in real time. What I saw when I stepped outside made my stomach drop with the kind of visceral recognition that comes from knowing you're witnessing something dangerous and wrong. Maria Santos stood pressed against the brick wall of her building, her small frame seemingly trying to disappear into the weathered red brick behind her. She was 67 years old, a widow who'd lived in the neighborhood since immigrating from Puerto Rico 40 years earlier. Her husband had died 3 years ago, leaving her with a rent-controlled apartment and a modest survivor's pension that barely covered her basic needs. Standing in front of her were two men. I recognized immediately Eddie Volkov and his cousin Dmitry, loan sharks who operated out of a pool hall 3 blocks over. They specialized in predatory lending to people who couldn't get legitimate credit, charging interest rates that were criminally usurious, and collecting debts through intimidation and violence. Eddie was doing the talking, his voice loud enough to carry across the street, making sure everyone watching understood the power dynamic at play. He was waving papers in Maria's face, documents that presumably showed the money she owed, though I suspected those papers were as fabricated as the inflated interest rates he was quoting. Dmitry stood to the side, arms crossed over his massive chest, serving as the silent physical threat that made Eddie's words even more frightening. But what made this scene particularly horrifying was the little girl standing next to Maria, clutching her grandmother's skirt with both hands. Sophia was 7 years old, Maria's granddaughter, who spent afternoons at Maria's apartment after school because both of Sophia's parents worked multiple jobs to keep their own family afloat. Sophia's eyes were wide with terror. She was too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize as danger. She could see the fear in her grandmother's face, could feel the tension radiating off the 2 large men who were invading their space and making her grandmother shake with something that looked like it might be tears or rage or both. Maria was trying to shield Sophia with her body while also trying to reason with Eddie, her accented English becoming more pronounced as stress overwhelmed her usually careful pronunciation. She was explaining that she'd paid what she owed, that the interest couldn't possibly be correct, that she needed more time to figure out the discrepancies between what she'd borrowed and what they claimed she now owed. Eddie wasn't listening or didn't care, his performance calibrated for the watching crowd rather than for Maria herself. He wanted everyone on this block to see what happened to people who didn't pay their debts on time, wanted to instill fear that would make his other customers prioritize his payments over rent or food or any other obligation. I should have walked away. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to go back inside the market, finish my shopping, go home to my own problems, and let Maria deal with hers. Eddie and Dmitry were dangerous men with dangerous connections, and inserting myself into their business would accomplish nothing except painting a target on my own back. But I couldn't walk away because of Sophia, because watching a 7-year-old girl witness her grandmother being terrorized by loan sharks was the kind of thing that stays with you forever, that changes you in ways you can't undo. I'd seen too much already in my 43 years living in this neighborhood, had witnessed too many small cruelties and injustices that I'd done nothing about, because doing something seemed futile or dangerous or both. Maybe this time would be different. Or maybe I was just tired of my own cowardice and looking for a reason to stand up for something, even if standing up meant getting knocked down. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped off the curb and walked toward the confrontation. My heart hammering in my chest, but my feet moving forward anyway. Propelled by something that was part moral outrage and part self-disgust, at all the previous times I'd chosen safety over courage. Eddie noticed me approaching and turned that predatory attention in my direction, his eyes calculating whether I represented a threat or just another audience member getting too close to the show. I raised my hands in a gesture meant to be non-threatening, trying to position myself between Eddie and Maria without making it look like that's what I was doing. I told him this wasn't the right place for this conversation, that there was a child present, that maybe they could work out payment arrangements somewhere less public. My voice came out steadier than I felt, years of customer service jobs having taught me how to maintain calm tones, even when my insides were churning with fear. Eddie laughed at me. Actually laughed. Like my concern for basic human decency was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. He asked if I was Maria's lawyer, or maybe her boyfriend, making both suggestions sound equally ridiculous and insulting. Dmitri uncrossed his arms and took a step closer to me, a silent reminder that this situation could turn violent very quickly if they decided I was more than just an annoyance. The crowd around us had grown larger, maybe 20 people now, but no one else was stepping forward to help. They just watched with that particular mix of sympathy and relief that comes from seeing someone else targeted by predators you've managed to avoid so far. That's when everything changed. A black Mercedes pulled up to the curb, its presence so out of place in this working-class neighborhood that it immediately drew everyone's attention away from the confrontation. The car was immaculate, expensive, the kind of vehicle that announced money and power before anyone even stepped out of it. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged who I'd seen before but never spoken to. Someone whose reputation preceded him so thoroughly that his name was spoken in whispers when it was spoken at all. Vincent Marchetti was in his late 50s, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. His silver hair perfectly styled, his face lined with the kind of weathering that comes from making hard decisions and living with their consequences. He owned several legitimate businesses in the neighborhood, a restaurant, a dry cleaner, a social club, but everyone knew those were just fronts for his real operations. He ran the most powerful organized crime family in this part of the city, controlling everything from the ports to the construction unions to the political machinery that kept certain investigations from going anywhere. He was, by every definition, a dangerous man who'd built his empire on violence and corruption and the systematic exploitation of the very neighborhood he'd grown up in. But Vincent Marchetti also had rules, codes he enforced with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his business operations. One of those rules involved how his territory was managed, who was allowed to operate within it, and what kinds of activities he would and wouldn't tolerate. Independent operators like Eddie and Dmitri were supposed to check in with Vincent's organization, pay tribute, and follow certain guidelines about how they conducted their business. Street-level loan sharks were tolerated as long as they operated discreetly, targeted the right people, and didn't create situations that drew unwanted attention from law enforcement or media. What Eddie was doing right now, shaking down an elderly widow in broad daylight with a child present and 20 witnesses watching, violated multiple aspects of that understanding. Vincent's appearance wasn't coincidental. Someone in the crowd must have made a phone call, recognized that this situation was spiraling out of control, and decided that higher authorities needed to intervene before things got worse. Or maybe Vincent just happened to be driving by and saw the commotion. Either way, his presence instantly transformed the power dynamics of the entire situation in ways that Eddie and Dmitri were only beginning to understand as they recognized who had just arrived. Eddie's face went pale as Vincent walked toward us, his earlier bravado evaporating like water on hot pavement. He immediately started trying to explain himself, his voice taking on a pleading quality that was pathetic compared to how he'd been speaking to Maria just moments before. He told Vincent this was just business, just a simple debt collection, nothing that warranted Vincent's personal attention or concern. Vincent didn't respond, didn't acknowledge Eddie's words at all. He walked past Eddie and Dmitri as if they were invisible, moving directly to Maria, who was still pressed against the wall, with Sophia clinging to her. Vincent's demeanor changed completely as he addressed Maria, his voice gentle in a way that seemed impossible coming from someone with his reputation. He asked if she was all right, if these men had hurt her or her granddaughter, if she needed medical attention or somewhere safe to go. Maria's response was halting, confused by this sudden reversal, uncertain whether this new arrival was salvation or just a different kind of threat. Vincent seemed to understand her hesitation because he introduced himself politely, explained that he owned the restaurant 2 blocks over, said he'd noticed the situation and wanted to make sure she was safe. It was a performance of civility and concern that was probably genuine. Vincent had a reputation for protecting certain people in the neighborhood, particularly elderly residents and children, but was also calculated to demonstrate to everyone watching that he was the authority here, not Eddie and his muscle. Then Vincent turned back to Eddie and Dmitri, and the temperature seemed to drop despite the summer heat. His voice was quiet when he spoke, forcing Eddie to strain to hear him, making everyone in the crowd lean in to catch his words. Vincent asked Eddie, who gave him permission to operate in this neighborhood, who told him it was acceptable to harass elderly women on public streets, who thought collecting debts in front of children was appropriate business practice. Eddie stammered through attempted explanations, claiming he'd paid his tribute last month, insisting this was just routine collection that had gotten slightly out of hand. Vincent let him finish, then told him to show the documentation of the debt. Eddie scrambled to produce the papers he'd been waving in Maria's face earlier, handing them over with trembling hands. Vincent examined them carefully, his face impassive as he read through the terms and calculations. After a full minute of silence, he looked up at Eddie and stated flatly that the debt was forged, the signature didn't match Maria's handwriting, and the interest calculations were not just usurious, but mathematically impossible. Maria had never borrowed any money from Eddie, Vincent declared. This was a complete fabrication designed to extort money from a vulnerable widow who Eddie thought had no one to protect her. The pronouncement hung in the air like a verdict, and I could see Eddie's face cycle through denial, panic, and finally resignation as he realized his scam had just been exposed in the worst possible way by the worst possible person. Vincent handed the forged documents back to Eddie and told him to leave. Not just leave this street, but leave this neighborhood entirely. Eddie and Dimitri's operation was done here, their protection revoked, their tribute no longer accepted. If Vincent saw them working anywhere in his territory again, the consequences would be severe and permanent. The threat was delivered calmly, almost conversationally, but everyone present understood exactly what Vincent meant. Eddie tried one last desperate attempt to negotiate, to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, but Vincent cut him off with a look that could have frozen blood. Eddie and Dimitri backed away, trying to maintain some shred of dignity as they retreated to their car parked half a block away. The crowd watched them go in complete silence, bearing witness to a humiliation that would be talked about for weeks in every bar and corner store in the neighborhood. Vincent waited until their car pulled away before turning back to Maria, his expression softening again into something that approached grandfatherly concern. He asked her if she had somewhere safe to stay tonight in case Eddie was stupid enough to try retaliation. Maria assured him she'd be fine, that her son lived upstairs and would look after her. Vincent nodded, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, pressing it into Maria's hand and telling her to call if she had any more problems from anyone. The gesture was both protection and claim. Maria was now under Vincent's umbrella, marked as someone who shouldn't be bothered, connected to power in ways that would make other predators think twice before targeting her. Before Vincent left, he looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. Our eyes met and held for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for me to understand that he'd noticed my earlier attempt to intervene, that he'd registered my presence and my willingness to step into the situation when others had just watched. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, acknowledgement between two people who'd both tried to help Maria in their different ways with their different resources. Then he got back into his Mercedes and drove away, leaving behind a crowd that slowly began to disperse, people returning to their shopping and their routines while processing what they'd just witnessed. I stood there for another moment, my earlier adrenaline fading into a shaky exhaustion that made my legs feel weak. Maria was hugging Sofia tightly, murmuring reassurances in Spanish that everything was okay now, that the bad men were gone, that they were safe. I caught Maria's eye and she mouthed thank you to me, acknowledging my small act of support even though Vincent's intervention had been what actually resolved the situation. I nodded back, feeling unworthy of her gratitude, but accepting it anyway because refusing would somehow diminish the moment of human connection we'd shared in the middle of all that ugliness. I went back into the market and retrieved my abandoned shopping basket, going through the mechanical motions of completing my purchases while my mind replayed the scene outside. The woman at the register was talking to another customer about what had just happened, their voices animated with the excitement that comes from witnessing drama without being directly involved. They were discussing Vincent Marchetti, debating whether he was a hero or just another criminal, whether what he'd done was justice or just one predator defending his territory from poachers. I didn't join their conversation because I didn't have simple answers to those questions. Vincent had saved Maria from immediate danger, had exposed Eddie's fraud, had used his power to protect someone vulnerable. But that same power came from decades of criminal enterprise, from violence and corruption, and all the ways that organized crime damaged communities, even as it occasionally protected individual community members. Could you call someone a hero when their capacity to help came from their willingness to hurt others? Could you be grateful to someone whose protection was itself a form of control? The questions had no clean answers, just complicated truths that existed simultaneously without canceling each other out. Vincent was both Maria's savior and the reason people like Eddie felt they could operate in this neighborhood at all, the apex predator who occasionally ate smaller predators but whose presence didn't make anyone safer in any fundamental way. Over the following days, I heard various versions of what had happened to Eddie and Dimitri. Some people said they'd left the city entirely, moved their operations to another state where Vincent's reach didn't extend. Others claimed they'd been found beaten badly enough to require hospitalization, a message sent about what happened to people who ignored Vincent's orders. A few insisted they'd simply disappeared, that their bodies were probably in the river or buried somewhere in the Pine Barrens, where so many other people who'd crossed the wrong person had ended up. I didn't know which story was true and didn't particularly care. Whatever had happened to them was a direct consequence of their own choices, their decision to prey on vulnerable people, and their catastrophic misjudgment about Maria's connections. I did know that their loan sharking operation collapsed completely, that the people who'd been making payments to them suddenly found themselves free of those debts, whether they'd been legitimate or fabricated. The vacuum Eddie and Dimitri left was eventually filled by other operators, because that's how these ecosystems work. Remove one predator and another emerges to take the same niche, but those new operators were more careful, more discreet, more aware that certain lines shouldn't be crossed if they wanted to survive in Vincent Marchetti's territory. Maria became something of a neighborhood legend after that day. Her story told and retold until it took on mythical qualities that probably bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. In some versions, she'd somehow summoned Vincent through sheer force of will, her prayers or curses or secret connections calling down powerful protection at exactly the right moment. In others, Vincent had been her secret benefactor for years, watching over her from a distance because of some ancient debt or connection no one else knew about. The truth was probably much simpler. Someone had made a phone call, Vincent or one of his people had shown up to address a situation that was creating public disturbance in their territory, and they'd handled it in a way that reinforced their authority while also helping someone who deserved help. But people prefer stories with deeper meaning, with cosmic justice, and hidden connections. So the mundane truth got embellished into something more satisfying. Maria never corrected the stories, never explained what connection, if any, she had to Vincent. She just accepted her new status as someone under protection, someone who wouldn't be bothered by the various small-time criminals and scammers who worked this neighborhood looking for easy targets. Sophia continued coming to her apartment after school, no longer haunted by the memory of scary men making her grandmother cry, that trauma hopefully fading into the general background noise of growing up in a neighborhood where bad things sometimes happened but were survived. I never spoke to Vincent Marchetti directly after that day, but I noticed him more often after the incident with Maria. He was around the neighborhood, regularly eating at his restaurant, standing outside his social club, talking with men in expensive suits, attending funerals at the Catholic Church, where generations of Italian families had been baptized and buried. He had a presence that was both ordinary and extraordinary, just another older man in a neighborhood full of older men, except everyone gave him extra space and extra deference. Everyone adjusted their behavior slightly when he was nearby. I'd catch myself watching him sometimes, trying to understand how someone could contain such contradictions. Family man and criminal, neighborhood protector and source of neighborhood decay, someone who enforced civility through incivility and defended vulnerable people through methods that created vulnerability for others. He never acknowledged me again after that single nod on Delancey Street, and I was fine with that. I didn't want to be connected to Vincent's world any more than that one moment of shared purpose when we both tried to help Maria. His world was dangerous, governed by rules and codes I didn't fully understand and didn't want to learn. I was content to remain on the periphery, bearing witness without being implicated, aware, but uninvolved in the complex machinery that actually ran this neighborhood beneath its surface, appearance of ordinary working-class life. The incident changed something in me, though I couldn't articulate exactly what for a long time after. I'd taken a small risk by stepping into that situation. And while my contribution had been minimal compared to Vincent's intervention, it had mattered in the moment. Maria had seen that someone cared enough to try to help, even if that help was inadequate. The crowd had seen that action was possible, that standing up to predators wasn't completely futile, even if it also wasn't entirely effective. I'd proven to myself that I wasn't quite as cowardly as I'd believed, that when pushed, I could overcome fear and self-interest long enough to do the right thing. It was a small revelation, modest and limited, but it shifted how I moved through the neighborhood after that. I paid more attention to the power dynamics around me, to the small cruelties and injustices that happened daily, to the moments when intervention might make a difference. I didn't become some kind of vigilante or community activist, didn't transform into someone brave and noble, but I stopped looking away quite as reflexively, stopped assuming my actions couldn't matter, stopped using my own vulnerability as an excuse for complete inaction. Maybe that was all Maria's situation could teach me, not that the world was just or fair, but that bearing witness and showing solidarity had value, even when the ultimate resolution came from sources I couldn't control or entirely approve of. Years have passed since that Tuesday afternoon on Delancey Street, and the neighborhood has changed in ways both subtle and profound. The market where I was shopping closed down, unable to compete with a chain supermarket that opened 6 blocks away. The building where Maria lived was sold to developers and converted into luxury condos, displacing her and dozens of other longtime residents who couldn't afford the new rents. Vincent Marchetti died 5 years ago, supposedly of natural causes, though there were whispers about whether his death had been quite as peaceful as his family claimed. His organization, fractured after his death, different factions fighting for control, but the stability he'd imposed through force and personality fragmenting into chaos until federal prosecutors moved in and took down most of the major players in a massive RICO case that made national news. The neighborhood's character shifted as property values rose and working-class families were priced out, replaced by young professionals who saw the area as authentic and gritty without having to live through the actual grinding reality of poverty and crime that authenticity and grit actually meant. I still live here, barely able to afford my rent-controlled apartment, watching the transformation with mixed feelings about whether change is progress or just displacement, wearing a prettier mask. But I still think about Maria and Sophia sometimes, especially when I see elderly people or children navigating the neighborhood's various dangers and difficulties. I wonder if Sophia remembers that afternoon, if it left any lasting impression on her understanding of how the world works, if she has any idea how close her grandmother came to being victimized by predators who saw her vulnerability as opportunity. I wonder if Maria kept Vincent's business card, if she ever had reason to call that number, if the protection he'd extended lasted beyond his death or evaporated with his organization's collapse. I wonder about Eddie and Dimitri too, whether they learned anything from their encounter with Vincent or just found new victims in new territories, whether their story ended badly, or whether they somehow survived and continued preying on desperate people who had no Vincent Marchetti to call on when things got bad. These are questions without answers, stories whose conclusions I'll never learn, lives that intersected with mine for a brief moment and then diverged into unknown futures. All I can do is carry the memory of that day, the shouting that drew me outside, a little girl clutching her grandmother's skirt, the loan sharks performing dominance for an audience, the expensive car pulling up, the subtle power shift, the exposed fraud, the quiet threats, the protection extended, the crisis resolved. It's a memory that contains everything complicated about living in neighborhoods like this. The violence and the protection, the predators and the defenders, the systems that exploit and occasionally shield, and the moral ambiguities that can't be reduced to simple stories about good and evil, because the real world doesn't work that way, no matter how much we wish it did. I still walk past where the market used to be, though it's a boutique coffee shop now, that charges $7 for drinks. I don't understand how to order. Sometimes when I pass that corner, I can almost see Maria pressed against the brick wall, Sophia hiding in her grandmother's skirt, Eddie waving his fraudulent documents, Vincent emerging from his Mercedes like some kind of dark guardian angel. The image has become mythological in my memory, larger than the actual moment probably was, invested with meanings and significance that may or may not have been present at the time. Memory works that way, transforming ordinary events into parables, finding lessons and morals in ambiguous situations, creating coherence from chaos. The truth is, I don't know what that day meant beyond its immediate resolution of a specific crisis. I don't know if Vincent was a hero or a villain or both or neither. I don't know if my small attempt to help mattered in any real way, or just made me feel better about my usual passivity. I don't know if Maria would have been better off in a neighborhood without Vincent's kind of power, or if she'd have been more vulnerable to predators like Eddie without that higher authority to call on. These are questions without answers, or with so many possible answers that choosing one feels arbitrary and incomplete. What I do know is that I was there, I saw what happened, I participated in my small way, and I carry that experience forward into whatever comes next, trying to learn from it even though I'm not entirely sure what the lesson is supposed to be. The coffee shop where the market used to be has different owners now, the original investors having sold when the neighborhood became too expensive even for them. The building where Maria lived is full of people who don't know her name or her story, who sleep in apartments that were someone else's home before developers saw profit in displacement. Vincent's restaurant is now a fusion place that serves expensive small plates to people who think eating in this neighborhood makes them adventurous and culturally sophisticated. Everything changes, nothing stays, the city consumes and transforms and moves forward without sentiment or memory. But some of us remember. Some of us carry the stories forward, pass them on to whoever will listen, maintain the oral history of a place that's being systematically erased by market forces and development pressures. Maria and Sophia and Vincent and Eddie and Dimitri, they're all part of the neighborhood's real history, the one that exists beneath the sanitized version sold to newcomers as heritage and character. Their story says something true about power and vulnerability, about protection and exploitation, about the complicated ways people survive in systems that weren't designed for their survival. Whether anyone learns anything from that story, whether it changes how people understand the place they live and the forces that shape it, I can't say. All I can do is remember accurately, tell it honestly, when occasions arise, and hope that bearing witness counts for something, even when I can't measure exactly what that something is, or whether it makes any difference at all. I ran into Sophia about 3 years ago, completely by chance, at a community meeting about affordable housing. She was in her late 20s by then, working as a social worker for a nonprofit that helped immigrant families navigate the city's social services bureaucracy. I recognized her immediately. Despite the years that had passed, she had Maria's eyes. That same determined set to her jaw that her grandmother had shown even in moments of fear. She was presenting data about displacement in our neighborhood, showing graphs and statistics that quantified what those of us who'd lived here for decades already knew. Viscerally, that working-class families were being systematically pushed out by rising rents and property values, that the community's character was being erased by gentrification dressed up as revitalization. After the meeting, I approached her and introduced myself, mentioning that I'd known her grandmother. Sophia's face brightened with recognition when I mentioned Maria's name, though I could see she didn't specifically remember me from that day on Delancey Street. She was probably too young then for individual faces to have registered beyond the general impression of scary men in watching adults. We went for coffee afterward, and she told me about Maria's last years, how she'd fought the building conversion until the end, how she died 6 months after being forced to move from the apartment she'd lived in for 4 decades. Maria had never fully recovered from the displacement, Sophia explained. The stress of the move, the loss of her community support network, the confusion of navigating a new neighborhood where she didn't know anyone, all of it had taken a severe toll on her physical and mental health. She developed depression for the first time in her life at age 74, stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining the routines that had structured her days for so long. Sophia had tried to help, visiting multiple times a week, bringing food, attempting to connect Maria with services and support groups for seniors. But Maria had essentially given up, Sophia said. Her will to continue broken, not by any single catastrophic event, but by the accumulation of losses, her husband, her home, her neighborhood, her sense of place and belonging. She died in a nursing facility in Queens, far from everything familiar, surrounded by strangers who didn't speak Spanish and didn't know anything about the life she'd lived or the community she'd been part of. Sophia's voice was thick with anger and grief as she recounted this. Anger at the developers and politicians and economic forces that had killed her grandmother as surely as any disease, grief at the injustice of watching someone who'd survived so much ultimately defeated by displacement disguised as progress. I listened without offering platitudes because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be inadequate or insulting to the magnitude of what Maria had lost and what Sophia was still processing years after her grandmother's death. We talked for over 2 hours that day, and Sophia eventually asked me if I remembered the incident with the loan sharks. I told her I did, that I'd been there, that I'd witnessed the whole thing. Sophia said she'd thought about that day often over the years, trying to understand what had actually happened, why those men had targeted her grandmother, who the well-dressed man in the expensive car had been. Maria had never fully explained it to her, had given vague answers when Sophia asked questions as she got older, had clearly wanted to shield her granddaughter from the neighborhood's darker realities. But Sophia had eventually pieced together the truth from context clues and overheard conversation, had figured out that Vincent Marchetti was a Mafia boss, and that her grandmother had somehow been under his protection after that day. She asked me if I thought Vincent had been a good man or a bad man, if his intervention had been heroic, or just one criminal defending his territory from other criminals. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that I had been asking myself the same questions for years without arriving at satisfactory answers. Vincent had saved Maria from immediate danger, I said, but he was also part of the system that created people like Eddie in the first place. He'd protected her grandmother, but his protection was itself a form of power that came from violence and exploitation. The contradictions couldn't be resolved, I explained, only held simultaneously and accepted as the complicated reality of how neighborhoods like ours actually functioned beneath their surface appearances. Sophia said something then that I've thought about many times since. She told me that her grandmother used to say the world was full of devils, but some devils protected you from other devils. And you had to be grateful to whichever devil kept you safe, even if you knew they were still a devil. It was a pragmatic philosophy born from decades of navigating systems designed to exploit vulnerability. From learning that purity was a luxury that poor immigrants couldn't afford, that survival sometimes meant accepting help from sources you'd prefer not to be indebted to. Maria had understood that Vincent Marchetti was dangerous and criminal, Sophia explained. But she'd also understood that his intervention had saved her from a situation that might have escalated into violence or financial ruin. She'd been grateful while also being under no illusions about what kind of man Vincent was or where his power came from. That nuanced understanding, gratitude without admiration, acknowledgement without approval, was something Maria had tried to pass on to Sophia, a lesson about navigating a world where clear moral choices were rarely available, and where survival often meant accepting help from devils because angels didn't show up when you needed them. Sophia had taken that lesson into her social work, she said, learning to help people through systems that were themselves deeply flawed, accepting that you worked with the tools and resources available even when those tools were inadequate and those resources were tainted by the same exploitation you were trying to address. Our conversation that day marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Sophia and I started meeting regularly, comparing notes on neighborhood changes, sharing stories about the community's history that newer residents didn't know, and developers preferred to forget. She introduced me to other people who'd been displaced from our neighborhood, families scattered across the outer boroughs and New Jersey, maintaining connections to a place they could no longer afford to live in, but still considered home. These conversations revealed patterns I'd only partially understood before, how displacement wasn't random or natural, but was engineered through policy decisions and investment strategies, how the neighborhood's transformation served specific economic interests while destroying the social fabric that had made it livable for working-class families. I learned about the complex relationships between organized crime and community stability, how Vincent's generation of mobsters had maintained certain boundaries and enforced certain rules that, while serving their own interests, had also provided a form of order that newer, more chaotic criminal elements didn't provide. The neighborhood after Vincent's death and his organization's collapse had become more dangerous in some ways, Sophia pointed out, because the vacuum was filled by groups that didn't have the same investment in community relationships or reputation management that Vincent's old-school approach had required. Through Sophia, I also learned what had actually happened to Eddie and Dimitri, facts that had been obscured by neighborhood rumor and speculation. They hadn't been killed or permanently driven from the city, as some stories claimed. Vincent had made an example of them without resorting to the kind of violence that would draw federal attention. They'd been beaten badly enough to require hospitalization that part of the stories was true, but the beating had been calculated to cause maximum pain without permanent damage or death. More significantly, word had been put out through various criminal networks that Eddie and Dimitri were untrustworthy, that they'd violated fundamental codes about how business was conducted, that anyone who worked with them or protected them would be considered enemies of Vincent's organization. This reputational destruction was more effective than physical violence would have been. Eddie and Dimitri found themselves unable to operate anywhere in the tri-state area, their names toxic in every criminal circle, their ability to make a living through illegal means completely eliminated. Last Sophia had heard, Eddie was working a legitimate job at a warehouse in Pennsylvania, his old life completely destroyed, surviving but defeated in ways that were probably worse than a quick death would have been. Dimitri had apparently returned to Russia, unable to rebuild any kind of operation in America after Vincent's intervention had marked him as unreliable and incompetent. The story of what happened to Eddie and Dimitri was itself a lesson in how power operates at different levels, Sophia observed. The legal system had never touched them for their loan sharking or their harassment of Maria. They'd violated no laws that prosecutors would bother pursuing, or at least no laws that could be proven in court with Maria's testimony and the forged documents that had conveniently disappeared after Vincent's intervention. But Vincent's form of justice had been swift and comprehensive, destroying their ability to operate without requiring trials or evidence, or any of the procedural protections that the legal system provided. It was effective in ways that legal justice rarely was for people like Maria, but it was also arbitrary and unaccountable, dependent entirely on Vincent's personal judgment and willingness to intervene. What happened to people who needed protection but didn't get Vincent's attention? Sophia asked rhetorically. What happened when the powerful decided someone wasn't worth protecting, or when the powerful themselves were the source of the threat? These questions haunted her work as a social worker, she said, because she saw daily how people fell through gaps in systems that were supposed to protect them. How official mechanisms of justice and safety were inadequate for populations that lacked resources and connections. Vincent's intervention for Maria was exceptional precisely because most vulnerable people didn't have access to that kind of protection, didn't have anyone who'd make a phone call on their behalf or show up in a Mercedes to reset power dynamics in their favor. I shared with Sophia my own complicated feelings about that day, about my small attempt to intervene and how inadequate it had been compared to Vincent's effective resolution. I told her about the guilt I'd carried for years, about all the times I hadn't intervened in similar situations, all the injustices I'd witnessed and done nothing about because action seemed futile or dangerous. Sophia listened without judgment, then pointed out something I hadn't fully considered. My presence in that moment, she said, had mattered even if it hadn't been decisive. Someone in the crowd had made the phone call that brought Vincent, and that person had probably been emboldened by seeing me step forward, seeing that intervention was possible, even if risky. The crowd's attention had been focused by my action, creating witnesses who could later testify to what had happened if needed, making Eddie's behavior more visible and therefore more problematic from Vincent's perspective. My attempt to help hadn't saved Maria directly, but it had been part of the chain of events that led to her salvation. That was how change actually happened. Sophia argued through accumulations of small actions that created conditions where larger interventions became possible or necessary. Waiting for individual heroic acts was futile. What mattered was creating cultures where people looked out for each other, where intervention was normalized rather than exceptional, where vulnerability didn't automatically equal victimization, because communities developed immune responses to predators and exploitation. Sophia's perspective challenged my tendency toward cynicism and despair about neighborhood dynamics and urban change. She showed me organizing efforts that were fighting displacement, tenant unions that were resisting landlord harassment, community groups that were documenting neighborhood history and demanding that development projects include affordable housing. These efforts were small and often unsuccessful against the massive economic forces pushing gentrification. But they mattered anyway, Sophia insisted. They maintained social connections that isolation and displacement tried to sever. They created records and narratives that countered the sanitized versions developers sold. They built skills and confidence that people carried forward into other struggles. Most importantly, they reminded people that they had agency, that they weren't just victims of forces beyond their control, but participants in shaping their community's futures, even when outcomes weren't what they hoped for. I started attending more of these meetings and events, adding my voice and my memories to collective efforts to preserve and defend what remained of the neighborhood I'd known. It was modest work with unclear impact, but it was something, and something was better than the passive witnessing I'd settled into for too many years. Sophia's example, her transformation of personal grief and anger into productive organizing and service, showed me that bearing witness was only valuable if it led somewhere, if it motivated action, rather than just accumulating stories and memories that died with their carriers. One evening, Sophia and I were walking through the neighborhood after a particularly frustrating community board meeting where residents' concerns about a new development project had been dismissed with barely disguised contempt. We were both angry and discouraged, questioning whether any of this work made a difference when the outcomes seemed predetermined by forces that didn't care about community input. We ended up at the corner where Vincent had confronted Eddie and Dimitri, now home to an upscale cocktail bar that neither of us could afford to drink in. Sophia stood looking at the spot where her grandmother had been pressed against the wall, where she herself had clung to Maria's skirt in terror, where Vincent had emerged from his Mercedes and transformed the situation through sheer force of presence and power. She said quietly that she missed that kind of certainty, that decisive intervention that resolved problems immediately, even if the methods were questionable. Social work and community organizing were slow and frustrating, she admitted, full of compromises and partial victories and situations that never fully resolved. Sometimes she fantasized about having Vincent's kind of power, being able to walk into rooms and fix problems through authority that couldn't be questioned or resisted. But then she reminded herself why she'd rejected that path, why she'd chosen the slower and harder route of systemic change and community empowerment rather than the quick fixes that powerful individuals could provide. The difference, Sophia explained, was sustainability and dignity. Vincent's intervention had saved Maria from Eddie and Dimitri, but it hadn't changed the conditions that created predatory lenders in the first place. It had protected one person through individual action, but it hadn't built systems that protected everyone. And it had required Maria to be grateful to someone whose power came from exploiting other people just like her, had required her to accept a form of protection that was itself a kind of control. The work Sophia did was slower and less dramatic, but it aimed at building collective power rather than depending on powerful individuals, at changing systems rather than just addressing symptoms, at creating conditions where people like Maria wouldn't need people like Vincent because communities would have their own mechanisms for protection and justice. It was harder to sustain hope in that kind of work, she admitted, especially on days when the forces of displacement and exploitation seemed overwhelming. But it was the only approach that aligned with her values about human dignity and self-determination, the only path that didn't recreate the same power imbalances it claimed to address. I understood what she meant, even if I couldn't match her level of commitment or optimism. My own participation in community work was more modest, more hedged, with doubt about whether it mattered. But Sophia's conviction was contagious enough to keep me showing up, adding my voice and presence to collective efforts, even when individual impact was impossible to measure. Years have passed since that conversation with Sophia at the corner where Maria once stood, threatened by loan sharks. The neighborhood has continued its transformation, now almost unrecognizable from the place where I grew up and lived most of my adult life. Most of the old-timers are gone dead, displaced, or moved to more affordable areas as rents climbed beyond what fixed incomes or working-class wages could sustain. The social fabric that once made this neighborhood a community rather than just a collection of buildings has frayed badly, replaced by a more transient population that lacks the deep connections and shared history that creates mutual support and collective identity. Vincent Marchetti's old restaurant is now a Thai-Italian fusion place that gets reviewed in Food magazine. The pool hall where Eddie and Dimitri used to operate is now a boutique gym offering specialized workout classes. The buildings where generations of immigrant families raised children and built lives are now filled with people who see the neighborhood as a lifestyle choice rather than a circumstance of limited options and economic necessity. I don't recognize most of my neighbors anymore. Don't know their names or their stories. Don't have the casual relationships that once meant someone would notice if you hadn't been seen in a few days, or would help carry groceries if they saw you struggling. That loss is hard to quantify, but profound in its impact on daily life and sense of belonging. But some things persist. Sophia continues her work, now running a nonprofit that she founded specifically to fight displacement and provide services to immigrant families navigating the city's complex bureaucracies. She's become a recognized advocate, testifying at city council hearings, organizing tenants, challenging developers' plans when they fail to include adequate affordable housing. Her success rate is probably less than 50%. But that 50% represents families who stayed in their homes, communities that maintained some continuity, people who had advocates when they needed them. She named her organization the Maria Santos Project, ensuring her grandmother's name would continue to mean something in a neighborhood that has largely forgotten the people who made it, what it was before capital decided it was valuable. I volunteer there occasionally, helping with administrative tasks and contributing to their oral history project that documents neighborhood stories before they're completely erased. It's my small way of honoring Maria's memory and the complicated lessons of that day on Delancey Street that power matters, that protection has value even when its sources are questionable, that bearing witness is only meaningful if it motivates action, that communities survive through collective effort rather than individual heroism, that devils sometimes protect you from other devils. But the real goal is building a world where you don't need devils at all because justice and safety are guaranteed through systems accountable to everyone rather than just the powerful. I think about Vincent Marchetti sometimes, wondering what he'd make of the neighborhood now, whether he'd see the changes as progress or loss, or just the inevitable march of economic forces that even his considerable power couldn't have stopped. His old organization is gone. Dismantled by federal prosecutors and internecine warfare, its remaining members either in prison or retired or dead. The codes and rules he'd enforced have disappeared with the structure that gave them meaning, replaced by more chaotic and less predictable criminal elements that lack his generation's investment in community relationships and reputation management. Whether the neighborhood is safer or more dangerous without him is debatable. Different kinds of crime, different kinds of predators, different power dynamics that are harder to navigate because they're less structured and predictable. What's undeniable is that a certain kind of order has been lost, replaced by a more fragmented and unstable situation, where vulnerability is harder to manage because protection isn't available even from questionable sources. I don't mourn Vincent's passing or his organization's collapse. They were criminals who caused real harm to real people, and the world is arguably better without them. But I also can't pretend that their absence has been purely positive, or that the official systems meant to replace their functions have been adequate to the task. The truth, as always, is complicated and unsatisfying, full of trade-offs and unintended consequences that resist simple narratives about progress or decline, heroes or villains, justice achieved or justice denied. The corner where I first saw Maria pressed against that brick wall is now a place I avoid when I can, not because it's dangerous, but because it represents too much loss. Maria herself, the neighborhood she was part of, the complicated social arrangements that provided inadequate but real forms of community support and protection, the sense that people belong to something larger than their individual lives and struggles. That corner is a memorial to things that don't exist anymore, to ways of living that have been displaced by economic forces that value property over people and profit over community. But it's also a reminder of a moment when something broke through, when power intervened on behalf of vulnerability. When a 7-year-old girl was spared watching her grandmother be victimized by predators, when devils protected someone from other devils, even if that protection came with complicated strings attached. The memory of that day carries lessons. I'm still trying to fully understand about power and protection, individual action and collective responsibility, the differences between fixing symptoms and addressing root causes, the importance of bearing witness, and the limitations of witness without action. These lessons don't resolve into clear principles or action plans, don't provide answers to the questions they raise about how to live ethically in systems designed to exploit vulnerability. But they persist in my consciousness, shaping how I see the neighborhood and my place in it, informing choices about when to intervene and when to organize, when to accept help from questionable sources, and when to reject it in favor of building alternatives that align better with values about dignity and self-determination. And that persistence, that continued engagement with difficult questions that have no easy answers, might be the only thing that gives meaning to bearing witness in the first place. Not the belief that I understand everything clearly, but the commitment to keep struggling with complexity rather than retreating into simple stories that comfort but don't illuminate.